And to start us off properly, I'm going to hand over to Brooke Prentice, who is going to acknowledge country for us.
Thanks, Rosie. As I always say, it's a privilege to bring an acknowledgement of country, so grateful to do that this morning. So I am a Waka Waka woman, and Waka Waka Nation is my grandmother, my nan's country, and is a nation in the lands now called Queensland. It is the place of the Bunya Pines and the native grasslands. I was born on the land of the Indingi people. I grew up and have lived most of my life on Gubbi Gubbi country, and also Turrbal, Yuggera and Jaggera country in Meanjin, the place now called Brisbane. But I now live on Gadigal country in the place now called Sydney. But today I'm physically on the lands of the Gamilaroi peoples. And so I pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. But today we do come together virtually as we gather online right across these lands now called Australia, as well as Aotearoa. And so you might like to post in the chat right now the lands upon which you sit and stand, and add your voice as an acknowledgement of country as we gather together in this Zoom room. And so together today, we acknowledge the traditional custodians wherever you stand or sit on these lands now called Australia, acknowledging the over 300 nations of Aboriginal peoples. The traditional custodians have been and continue to be stewards and caretakers of country on behalf of the Creator since time immemorial. And we must always remember that country is not just the lands, and country is not just the peoples. Country is all lands, waters, sky, trees, plants, animals, birds, fish, rocks, mountains, and all peoples. Beneath the concrete and bitumen and the carpet and whatever is beneath your feet today, this land holds many stories, all the ceremonies and celebrations seen and heard and been present to since time immemorial. I respect and honour the elders and leaders past, present and future. As we think of the past, I say thank you to those elders and leaders who fought for justice, equality, love and reconciliation or conciliation, so that I could have an education as an Aboriginal person, so that I could be a citizen of Australia as an Aboriginal person. We lament that for some of these elders, they never got to see the outcomes of what they fought for, and we thank them. As we think of the present, I thank the elders for the way in which they refresh, revitalise and maintain culture. And we are reminded that we stand or sit upon stolen land where sovereignty has never been ceded. May this reminder, as well as the fact that there is not true equality nor reconciliation between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples in these lands now called Australia, may this reminder drive us to take action for justice. I pay my respects to any Aboriginal peoples that might have joined us today, and also any Torres Strait Islander peoples that might be here today. And if you are Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander or Indigenous of another land, please do let me know in the chat. An acknowledgement of country is more than just words. It's actually about heart and mind coming together through that genuine want and act of building relationship with Aboriginal peoples. That does mean you make it personal, you share what you learn about the local peoples and the local lands, and you take steps towards building relationship. I promise to respect country and to walk softly and gently on these ancient lands. I invite you and call you to do the same, as we remember the words of many Aboriginal elders who teach us, care for country and country will care for you. Thank you for taking the time to acknowledge country with me today.
Thank you, Brooke. So we are here on a lovely Saturday morning with our panel Silences and Secrets. What we'll be doing today is we're hearing from 4 of us, from Brooke, Erin, myself and Joel. We will all give our papers and then have time for questions at the end. But if you've got a question that feels particularly relevant and you don't want to forget it, feel free to just pop it in the chat and we'll make sure we come back to it. And other than that, I feel like it's all the kind of standard Zoom etiquette of, mute. You're welcome to have your video on so we can see your smiling faces, but you're also welcome not to. That's absolutely your choice. And to start our panel today, we are going to be going back to Brooke. Brooke is Brooke is many things, and introducing her always feels a little bit difficult. Brooke is, she's a theologian and a writer and an activist. She's the CEO of Common Grace, and she's actually the first Indigenous woman to be the CEO of a national organisation. And so I'm very excited and feel very privileged to have her here with us today. And so I'd like to hand to Brooke for her paper, The Great Australian Silence. I think that was your full title. Thank you, Brooke.
Thanks so much, Rosie. So the year 2020 will go down in history and be remembered by words and phrases such as disrupted, disturbed, unprecedented, turbulent, as we embrace a new normal and learn to socially distance, self-isolate, and quarantine. These words and phrases have come about because of a global pandemic, but this year 2020, we have also continued to live through a global climate crisis, and attention has been drawn through the global Black Lives Matter movement. The year 2020, here in these lands now called Australia, was and is the anniversary of the 250 years from when Lieutenant James Cook arrived in these lands now called Australia. Although many statues, signs, history of towns still display the words discovered, with little to no mention of over 65,000 years of Aboriginal peoples from over 300 nations. Why the silence? Where is the truth telling? And are Aboriginal peoples invisible? Wiradjuri man and journalist Stan Grant in The Australian Dream says, sport has a way of really capturing the essence of what's happening in society. And if Stan Grant is correct and sport reflects our society, let us look at sport in 2020. In many places for many months in these lands now called Australia and the world, the stadiums were silent. The grounds were untouched. Even the Olympic torch went unlit. Stan Grant's words, of course, are in relation to racism in these lands now called Australia. And this silence is perhaps an opportunity to finally address the true history of these lands now called Australia. A true history which includes that the Creator placed Aboriginal peoples of over 300 nations here in these lands now called Australia over 65,000 years ago, or since the beginning of human civilization, or since time immemorial. A true history which includes that Aboriginal peoples were once 100% of the Australian population and counted in the millions. But today, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are 2.8% of the Australian population, and our population levels, 250 years since colonisation, have not returned to what they were pre-colonisation. It's a true history which includes Aboriginal people's law, our law, to know the Creator, to care for, to steward, to manage country, all of creation as instructed by the Creator, and to live in right relationship, of which the Creator teaches us as well. When we apply these three principles to the last 250 years, non-Indigenous Australia can be found wanting, can be found as blatantly disregarding, and can be found as destructive. Australia is still a land without treaty and treaties with Aboriginal peoples. The calls for National Truth-Telling Commission and a voice in and to Parliament have been rejected, ignored, and misunderstood, and we still face racism and injustice. As I say often, post-colonialism is only an academic aspiration, not a lived reality. These last 250 years have pushed Aboriginal peoples to the margins and have centred a white story in Australian society and the Australian Church. Racism and its prevalence and peculiarity towards Aboriginal peoples is embedded in the settlement or invasion a discussion and argument Australia can still not decide on or even have respectfully, at Cook's arrival at Kurnell on the 29th of April, 1770. Cook's journal describes the scene on the British first setting eyes upon Aboriginal peoples and describes seeing men, women, and children. Cook comments on the fact that all the Aboriginal peoples they see run away except for 2 men. He comments that the men seem opposed to the British landing on the shores, and so Cook fires his gun 3 times, wounding one of the Aboriginal men. And whilst Cook refers to us as men, women, and children, the response on first seeing Aboriginal people was to pull out a gun and fire not just 1, but 3 shots. Genesis 1:26 to 27 explains for us that all human beings are equally created in the image and likeness of God. But 250 years ago, Aboriginal peoples were not afforded this equality. And it could be argued still today in Australia in the year 2020, we are still not afforded this equality. There are also violations of the teachings of Christ. As Aboriginal Christian leader, Auntie Dr. Anne Patel-Gray in The Great White Flood points out, and this is what she says: Australian church racism violated not only many of the direct teachings of Christ, for example, in relation to loving your neighbour, Matthew 22:34 to 40, and to having faith, hope, and love, 1 Corinthians 13, but also many of the doctrines of the Christian church, creation, incarnation, resurrection, etc., and accepted doctrines such as truth and justice. She continues, in the name of Christianity, white Euro-Australians have committed all manner of horrors upon Aboriginal peoples. Their beliefs in a loving, living God must have somehow fallen off the ships as they travelled the oceans on their journeys to the Great South Land. Patel-Gray points out how racism is embedded in the Australian Church because of its more than 2 centuries of racism against the subjugation of Indigenous peoples it encountered. She continues, the Australian Church, in its activities and teachings, continually contradicted the liberating truth of Jesus Christ. It refused to speak the truth in the face of dispossession, massacres, cultural genocide, physical and mental tortures of many kinds, and more. It refused to live the truth in the light of the one who is the truth, that it choose to live not in truth, but rather in the lie of racism against the Aboriginal peoples. Part of the truth telling Australia needs to face up to is that its political and democracy is founded in colonisation and also in the theological as we look to the doctrine of discovery. The colonisation experience and present day realities for Indigenous people in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the United States is linked and firmly grounded in the doctrine of discovery. We also remember these 4 nations and their original response to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The doctrine of discovery is based in religion and theology, and therefore Christianisation of these lands now called Australia. In Discovering Indigenous Lands, Miller, Ruru, Berendt, and Lindbergh explain the interrelated impacts of colonisation and religion on Indigenous peoples. They say, when England and English colonists set out to explore, exploit, and settle new lands outside of Europe in the 15th through to the 19th centuries, they justified their claims to sovereignty and governmental and property rights over these territories and the Indigenous habitants with the discovery doctrines. This international law had been created and justified by religious and ethnocentric ideas of European superiority over the other cultures, religions, and races of the world. Let us not forget the words at the beginnings of colonisation in Australia from Reverend Samuel Marsden, the senior chaplain of New South Wales, when in 1819 he said about Aboriginal peoples, "The Aborigines are the most degraded of the human race. The time is not yet arrived for them to receive the great blessings of civilization and the knowledge of Christianity." However, in spite of the history of the last 250 years, and according to the last Australian census, 54% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people identify as Christian. It is nearly the same as the non-Indigenous population at 55%. Aboriginal peoples have the keys to unlocking the silences and secrets that have existed for far too long. As I say, it is a miracle Aboriginal peoples survived. That is no one else's miracle but God's. We are still here, and we are still here for a reason. We are part of God's story. We always have been, and we always will be. Whilst much has been spoken and written about with regards to Aboriginal people's intergenerational trauma, we also hold an intergenerational memory. 250 years ago, disease, destruction, and death combined with acts of dispossession and displacement. As we look at those words in light of 2020 and COVID-19, and we think of this intergenerational memory, we as Aboriginal peoples remember smallpox, Spanish flu, swine flu, and now COVID-19, and are constantly reminded our lives are not equal through the injustice of the lack of closing the gap, most pointedly highlighted through the worst life expectancy gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples of any Indigenous peoples in the entire world, right here in these lands now called Australia. As Australian state and territory borders start to open and reopen, we are reminded this is not the first time in living memory that borders have been closed. Whilst it is the first time for non-Indigenous peoples, we must remember our true history. And that is that up until 1967, Aboriginal people were not able to move freely. Permission had to be sought from the Chief Protector of Aborigines, a white man from the government. Permission was often denied, and the permission was not to cross a state border. It was simply to leave your community. The legacies of boundary streets in many of our capital cities are a constant reminder to this history. Whilst W.E.H. Stanner, a white male anthropologist, in his 1968 Boyer Lectures coined the term the Great Australian Silence, it is not Aboriginal peoples who have been silent. Aboriginal Christian leaders also have the keys to unlocking the silences and secrets that have existed for far too long. Part of the key is the long history of Aboriginal Christian leaders' voices, decade after decade after decade. We think of the likes of William Cooper, Pearl Gibbs, Sir Pastor Doug Nichols, Auntie Jean Phillips, Auntie Dr. Anne Patel Gray, and those of us as younger Aboriginal Christian leaders and theologians coming through, and many others. As I think of the words of Pearl Gibbs, where in 1941, it wasn't until 1941 on the radio station 2WL in Wollongong, where she raised her voice, she was given the opportunity to speak on radio to end the silence through the truth-telling. She appealed for equal citizenship, explaining the injustices of stolen wages and exposing the truth of the rape of Aboriginal women by white men and the horrors of then those babies being forcibly removed from their Aboriginal mothers through the stolen generations. This is what she said in the broadcast. And this was the first time, 1941. It is the first time in the history of Australia that an Aboriginal woman has broadcast an appeal for her people. I am more than happy to be that woman. My people have had 153 years of the white man's and white woman's cruelty and injustice and un-Christian treatment imposed upon us. I then think of William Cooper, who in a letter to the then Prime Minister Joseph Lyons on the 31st of March 1938 wrote this. History records that in the year 1771, white men first landed on the shores of what is now called Botany Bay. They claimed that they had found a new country, Australia. This country is not new. It was already in possession of and inhabited by millions of blacks who, while unarmed, accepting spears and boomerangs, nevertheless owned the country as their God-given heritage. From the standpoint of an educated black who can read the Bible, upon which British constitution and custom is founded, I marvel at the fact that while the textbook of present civilization, the Bible, states that God gave the earth to man, the Christian interferes with God's arrangement and stops not even a murder to take that which does not belong to them, but belongs to others by right or prior possession and by right of gift from God. The voice of Aboriginal Christian leaders throughout the decades. Aboriginal Christian leaders, through pain and trauma, through racism and injustice, have held to great creator spirit, have held to Jesus. Our culture, the world's oldest living continuing cultures, continues to call upon non-Indigenous peoples into right relationship, that law given to us by the Creator and reinforced to us by Jesus' call to love our neighbour today in the year 2020. My prayer is that you listen and are led by Aboriginal Christian leaders. It is time for this nation to do this and to listen to us in theology, Christian practice, mission and wisdom, and that together we can, this is the we, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and non-Indigenous peoples, that together we can hear a call that does rattle the colonial foundations, and that together we build a new foundation, a new structure, a strong foundation, a foundation created by the Creator millennia ago, an Australia I dream of, an Australia we build together, an Australia built on truth, justice, love, and hope. Because as Aboriginal peoples, we know that this leads to healing and hope. This leads to healing and hope, not just for Aboriginal peoples, but for all peoples. Thank you for listening to this paper today.
Thank you, Brooke. Second up today, we have Erin Sessions. Erin is here as a representative of Excelsior College and the Australian College of Theology, and she is presenting work today that will form part of her PhD. So I'd like to hand over to Erin Sessions.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully we don't have too many technical difficulties. Okay. So my paper is Stay and Submit, Protestant Christianity and Domestic and Family Violence. What have we learned from the body of evidence and where to now? So I narrow the scope quite a bit, and it's still a work in progress. So the hope is that it will form part of my critical introduction and part of my first chapter of my PhD. I've done things a little bit backwards in that I've written the other chapters first, good old reverse engineering. So now we're kind of getting towards the end and I'm coming up with what was my rationale? What was my justification? So before we get into that, I do want to say, just to acknowledge if there are any survivors in the room or our respective rooms, and just give you a bit of a trigger warning that obviously I do discuss domestic and family violence. So take some time to care for yourself, ground yourself, find a safe person, and obviously 1-800-RESPECT is always a great resource. So it's an open secret that Australia has an entrenched problem with domestic and family violence. Women all over these lands now called Australia and from all walks of life are abused in private and all too often they are silenced. From 2015, Julia Baird, along with Hayley Gleeson, showed us that Christian women across the spectrum of Protestant denominations are experiencing an added theological dimension to their abuse. They are told to submit to their husbands, endure, and stay. The instructions based on an interpretation of both Colossians 3:18 and Ephesians 5:22. Wives, submit yourselves to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. This divorces the verses from both their biblical and cultural context. The pushback and even abuse that Baird and Gleeson received in response to their investigative journalism also took on an interesting theological dimension. Despite the fact that earlier research in Anglican churches had yielded similar findings to Baird and Gleeson, and despite the fact that their investigations carried out in other faith communities yielded similar findings, and despite the fact that both the Australian government and Victorian Royal Commission had stated the importance of faith communities for addressing DFV, those studies had not resulted in the same public outcries of suspicion and derision. The idea that good Christian men, even ministers, were abusing their wives seemed unfathomable to some. The silver lining to all of this, let's call it incredulity towards Baird and Gleeson's claims, was an acknowledgement of what many organisations, including the Australian government, had already been calling for, that more research must be done. But before we survey some of that research, I wanted to give us a brief look and overview at the phenomenon of DFV. So from the Roman laws of chastisement, where a man was allowed to beat his wife if her behaviour reflected negatively on his reputation, through to the 19th century English rule of thumb, where a husband had the right to discipline his wife by hitting her with any reasonable instrument no thicker than his thumb. DFV has remained an ever-present feature of human history. However, it was not really until the 1970s, thank you second wave feminism, that DFV was recognised as a societal issue. In Australia, DFV usually results in a police call out, on average once every 2 minutes across these lands. But we're not in usual times, are we? The United Nations has reported an increase in DFV during COVID-19, referring to it as the shadow pandemic. It requires urgent government action and well-funded services. According to a recent survey by the Australian Institute of Criminology, almost 1 in 10 Australian women in a relationship have experienced DFV during the coronavirus crisis. 2/3 of these women have said that the abuse started or became worse during the pandemic. This has devastating consequences for victims, survivors, and for their families. DFV causes acute and chronic physical, psychological, and emotional harm, illness, disability, and for at least 1 woman a week, death. So in the face of such an overwhelming and pervasive problem, what can the Australian Church do to appropriately respond to the abuse in our communities? Reducing DFV is a national priority, and the government has a national plan to reduce violence against women and their children. The third action plan, so 2016 to 2019, especially at National Priority Area 3, focuses on primary prevention practices. So that's coinciding with my area of research. And it also focuses on assisting communities to better support women and their children who are experiencing violence at home. So one of the points, that's 3.9b, has a commitment to build the capacity of community and faith leaders to reject, prevent, and respond to violence. In 2015, a Queensland Government Special Task Force on Domestic Violence, commissioned by former Governor-General Quentin Bryce, highlighted the need for capacity building among faith leaders and communities. We also know from the 2016 Victorian Royal Commission into Family Violence that faith communities are vital settings for dealing with DFV, and that the trust and authority faith leaders have within their communities to influence attitudes is significant. Comprehensive, independent, Australian data regarding domestic violence within churches are long overdue. But there has also long been clear evidence that DFV exists inside our church communities. So turning to this research, the earliest of these studies is the pastoral report to the churches on sexual violence against women and children in the church community. This report was jointly produced by Catholic, Anglican, and Uniting Churches in Australia, the Churches of Christ, and the Salvation Army. The study found that not only congregants, but ministers too had sexually assaulted women in their own families as well as parishioners. A 1992 study out of the University of Queensland of 1,704 women from Anglican and Uniting churches, carried out by Dr. Glenys Conrad, found that 3.3% of women reported that they had been abused in just the past year. Perhaps more shockingly, it was reported that 14% of perpetrators were a part of church leadership. 1993's Public Face, Private Pain, the Anglican report about violence against women and the abuse of power within the church community. This was produced by the Anglican Diocese of Melbourne and the Victorian Centres Against Sexual Assault, was the turning point for churches beginning to confront the truth that violence against women occurs in their own communities. Last and Gilmore's research showed that the church had ignored and dismissed DFV, and that Christian men were systematically perpetrating violence against their wives. Sections of the report discuss the role of theology and church language in contributing to violence against women. The study examined violence against women in family, workplace, and church, including violence by ministers. It reported that women suffered physical and emotional abuse in silence, and that 9% of these women had been abused by ministers. Almost 25 years later, Baird and Gleeson unequivocally stated the painful reality that clergy are involved in criminal activity can no longer be ignored, and protocol is urgently needed in response to these acts where sexual violence is perpetrated against clergy wives and children. So for this prevention work and these protocols to be effective, we need the data. And the background to the call for more research into DFV in Christian contexts is also the Australian government's call for more research into domestic violence in a range of contexts, including Christian contexts. So the Australian government's focus on primary prevention and acknowledging that faith communities are key settings for this work. Their strategy includes building the evidence base in a number of priority areas, while noting that the data relating to violence against women and their children in Australia is extremely poor. As a result of this, the Australian Institute of Criminology reported on emerging issues in domestic and family violence research. The report segments the research on various at-risk people groups and identifies where further research is needed. These at-risk people groups are often the same people on the margins of our church communities. So my approach for this paper is to establish which of the identified research gaps have actually been addressed since the decade ago that Lorana Bartels wrote this report. Have we actually tried to fill the research gaps? And whether the research being carried out in Christian communities is considering these at-risk people groups. So this includes the elderly, people with disabilities, people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, the LGBTQIA community, the relevance of homelessness, the impact of DFV on children, and issues around perpetrator programs. So obviously today I'm going to have to really narrow the scope. So I'm going to look at where this work intersects with the work of my fellow panel members. So I've tended to focus in on Anglican studies, and I'll take a look at DFV that affects Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and how that might affect the LGBT+ community. I'd also like to acknowledge that obviously there are all kinds of intersectional issues, but I'm not going to have a chance to get into them. So in 2006, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner had noted that there are significant deficiencies in the availability of statistics and research on the extent and nature of family violence in Aboriginal communities. Unfortunately, an earlier report to the Australian government in 2001 suggested that priority should be placed on implementing anti-violence programs rather than on further quantitative research. Why the either or? Why not a both and? Why not consultation? So thankfully, as noted above, the national plan called for the establishment of a minimum data segmented by Indigenous status. Further research gaps, data deficiencies, and proposed ways forward include the underreporting, the need for responsive programs which are developed in consultation with, or better yet, led by members of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, the need for coordinated service delivery, and reviewing the effectiveness of community-oriented solutions. So this includes things like the involvement of community leaders and elders at a prevention level, intervention level, and then rehabilitative or restorative justice initiatives with offenders. So here I want to focus in, I'm going to narrow the scope again. I want to focus on the Aboriginal-led projects. So 3 such Aboriginal-led projects are the NPY Family Violence Program, Strong Women Talking, and Strong Culture, Strong Peoples, Strong Families. So NPY arose from the cross-border justice project of Western Australian, South Australian, and Northern Territory governments. It uses a holistic Ananu-led approach, which takes a long-term view to transforming communities. It recognises that violence occurs in a complex set of circumstances. Strong Women Talking is a Christian organisation based in Queensland, which integrates DFV education into a cultural framework. It's so that women, children, and families are more informed, thus helping them to break the cycle of violence. And Victoria's 10-year plan, Strong Culture, Strong Peoples, Strong Families, about 10 years ago, called for improving the effectiveness and efficiency of responses to Indigenous family violence through ongoing research and evaluation. They have, in fact, continued their research and their evaluation, and they've moved to the, just now in 2020, the Delta Agreement, which is working to ensure that services respond in a culturally safe way. It reflects the many voices and stories of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples living across Victoria. And the guiding principles of the agreement include self-determination, collaboration and partnerships, and cultural and trauma-informed resilience and healing approaches. There's obviously much more that I could say there, but I'm now going to turn to research on DFV in LGBT+ communities. So back in 2008, Jeffries and Ball argued the Australian criminological and social science research community had largely been silent on the issue of same-sex domestic violence. A 2009 study suggested that although the national plan does acknowledge domestic violence in lesbian relationships, it excludes such violence in gay male relationships and does not recognise the unique aspects of same-sex domestic violence. There's also research that suggests that for lesbians, what's acceptable or unacceptable or normal behaviour in a lesbian relationship isn't always clear. A 2010 study conducted by Kay and Jeffries found that the prevalence, types, and contextual triggers of violence in many male same-sex relationships often parallels abuse in opposite-sex relationships. But more research needs to be done. I wanted to highlight that some of the abuse that is specific to LGBT people and that needs to be better recognised in the research is things like threatening to out people. Rosie, do you need to tell me to shut up? Okay, I'm almost done. Things like threatening to disclose a person's HIV status. And so this can result in a double stigma, so being both abused and being outed. It could mean that LGBT people are less likely to report abuse. And a 2008 study found that when LGBT people did report abuse, only 6% who reported to police were referred to advice or support services. This leads me to another concern. There is still a lack of referral options. Where do we refer people? So I'm going to quickly skip ahead. The research we have into DFE is just the tip of the iceberg. There's little Australian research on the nature and prevalence of domestic abuse in church communities, and there is little data to support the efforts of churches and parachurch groups. Great strides forward have been made with organisations like NCLS and the research out of ANU. But their scopes are limited and they are not explicitly looking at the violence affecting people on the margins of our church communities. So here's my call for more research. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin.
Sorry, I went long.
It is absolutely okay. You went too much over. Because this is not my computer, I'm going to ask Joel to open up my my slides for me, because I will probably accidentally close the Zoom meeting. So next on our panel is me. My name is Rosie. I'm at Western Sydney University and I am completing a PhD there. I'm in our Religion and Society Research Cluster. And I'm just going to check with Joel that I presume I'm just, yes, great. And I do know how to use Joel's computer. So let's go. I should also probably time myself. This is where it all gets confusing. We're going to give that to Joel. Look at us go. Teamwork. Okay. So in August, I met up for coffee with Alana, a Sydney Anglican woman who has previously preached extensively to children and youth in parachurch ministries. At her current church, women preach on a semi-regular basis, but this is the first church Alana has attended where women preach to the full congregation. Alana tells me that the way that women can portray the gospel can be a really powerful and beautiful thing, and that women preaching is important for women to feel seen and empowered and valued by God. Believing that both suitably gifted women and men can preach would be enough by some definitions to call Alana an egalitarian. But as complementarians are assumed to believe that the Bible teaches there are distinct roles for men and women. Yet when I ask Alana where she would place herself on the scale of complementarian to egalitarian, she has trouble pinpointing what she believes. She says she's probably a complementarian, struggles to explain why she's not an egalitarian, and in trying to find her answer, she tells me this story. I heard someone, she says, it was so annoying. I was at a conference at the start of the year and he got up and preached on 1 Timothy about women preaching. And he said, this is an easy issue. The Bible just says don't do it. And I was like, it's actually not an easy issue. I'm glad that it's easy for you, white male in your 50s. That's great for you. But like, it's not easy for a lot of people. It might say something in the Bible and it seems clear, but it's not clear. And I think that that shows it's something we cannot fully understand or have full answers to. And I'm okay with it being murky. So it seemed like Alana felt she had to align with complementarianism. But in this moment, she also expressed unease with the complementarian idea that the Bible has a clear or a plain teaching that women should not preach. In this paper, I contend that this idea of plain teaching is a discursive trick that operates within complementarian discourse, producing an official teaching or an ideal or orthodox Christian identity that must be aligned with if Christians are to belong and be deemed properly Christian. It's therefore a disciplinary device and an exclusionary practice, which I suggest can be countered by listening to the voices it typically minimizes and excludes. My 2 guiding questions for today are, what does plain teaching do? And then a slightly longer question of what happens when the Sydney pulpit, a space assumed to be dominated by the voices of men, is open to the presence, voices, and experiences of women. In answering these questions, I draw on interviews that I conducted with staff and parishioners at 3 Sydney Anglican churches over the last year. For context, I'm going to offer a brief overview of what I mean by complementarian discourse, and then I'm going to map some answers to these questions. So complementarianism typically teaches that men and women are created equal in value, but different in terms of the ministries that are open to them in the church and the roles that they should perform in the home. Complementarianism promotes male headship or leadership and often, but not always, excludes women from teaching the Bible or having authority over men. It therefore adheres to a binary heteronormative framework. So that means it presumes and requires that Christian people will have heterosexual identities and marriages, and it forecloses the possibility of faithful queer relationships. It's usually thought of as a theology, a matter of personal faith. I'm shifting to think of complementarianism more as a shared story, a cultural script, or a discourse that's learned in sermons, advice books, and casual conversations. It's a story that works to shape not only how Christian people think of gender and sexuality, but also their place in the church and the place of the church in society. The ideals and consequences of complementarian discourse are maintained and reproduced through specific phrases, which form what we might think of as a language or grammar of complementarian discourse. And these key phrases are countercultural, equal but different, and plain teaching. Today, I'm ignoring the first two and focusing only on plain teaching. Which brings us to question number 1. What does plain teaching do? So Alana saw plain teaching in action when a male preacher suggested that it was really clear that the Bible prohibits women from preaching. Plain teaching here creates a single correct way of reading the Bible. It privileges the knowledge of the preacher and it invalidates other ways of reading the biblical text. This puts those who disagree out of alignment with the preacher and calls into question the validity of their faith. Women I interviewed spoke of this feeling of being out of alignment. So for example, Alice, who when pressed said she was a complementarian, said that when studying at Moore College, there was a suggestion that because I was convicted that women should preach in churches and have leadership roles, that I automatically took a step towards less faithful. While Catherine, who calls herself an egalitarian, says, you have a slightly different view on something and people think therefore you're not a Christian. She adds, I can understand the attraction of saying there's a plain reading and we just have to find it, but we don't do that with most of scripture. And often I find that the passages say we need to use a plain reading for are related to women. On other passages, they're happy to do the contextual work. So invoking plain teaching can become a way to regulate both gender and sexuality and which interpretations of the Bible are considered acceptable. So a key public example of this language in action would be Archbishop Glenn Davies' presidential address to Synod last year, where he responded to bishops who wanted to bless same-sex unions by saying, my own view is that if people wish to change the doctrine of our church, they should start a new church or join a church more aligned to their views, but do not ruin the Anglican church by abandoning the plain teaching of scripture. Please leave us. Here, plain teaching works as a disciplinary device, as blessing same-sex unions is depicted as against this plain teaching of scripture. Those who want to bless same-sex unions are told that their reading of scripture is not properly Christian, therefore they're not properly Christian, and they should leave. Plain teaching does this work by silencing and erasing other readings of scripture. So another example of this might be the Sydney Diocesan Doctrine Commission's 2017 paper, A Theology of Gender and Gender Identity, where the authors emphatically state that the Bible is unambiguous in its condemnation of homosexuality. And drawing on 1 Corinthians 6:9, the authors state that Paul uses distinct terms to voice this position, which ignores the fact that this language in the passage is actually highly contested. For example, Heather White in her book, Reforming Sodom, reminds us that the word homosexual only entered the Bible in the middle of the 20th century. And before that, to use Alana's words, it wasn't clear, it was murky. And if you would like to explore that murkiness, I would recommend Joel's book, A Place at His Table, which dedicates a whole chapter to the murkiness of those terms. So what does plain teaching do? It draws boundary lines between who is in and who is out. It ignores the witness of lived experience and the complexity and diversity with which Christians have approached biblical texts. It creates uniform behaviour and requires conformity. To borrow from Sarah Ahmed, who argues that power works as a mode of directionality, a way of orienting bodies in particular ways, we could say that plain teaching is both powerful and directional. It directs behaviour towards heteronormativity. It directs influence, power, and opportunities to teach towards ordained male clergy and those who can conform to their views. It directs opportunities away from women and other people who disagree. In short, plain teaching produces orthodoxy, and it maintains gendered norms and heterosexism in the church. Despite this, at all 3 Sydney Anglican churches that I attended for fieldwork, women did preach on a somewhat regular basis, which brings me to my second question of what happens when the Sydney pulpit, a space typically dominated by the voices and experiences of that ubiquitous straight white man, is opened to other voices. Specifically, what happens when women preach? The simplest answer, of course, is that when women preach, we hear them and we see them. When I spoke to clergy and parishioners about why women should preach, they consistently told me that having women in the pulpit provides a role model to other women in the congregation and that it operates as a sign that women are valued. Alice told me there's something inherently powerful about hearing someone's voice for 20 minutes. It says something about their authority and who they are, and that they have something valid or helpful to bring to the church. It signifies something about what the people who are part of that community believe, and it also means you get to hear the opinion, voice, encouragement, and teaching of a woman. When churches make space for women to preach to the whole congregation, it demonstrates that women are welcome, that their leadership is to be trusted and followed, that their experiences and testimonies, whether they be stories of flourishing and inclusion or of violence and exclusion, are valid. Women preaching can challenge the reproduction of uniform and exclusionary discourses and cultures within church communities. So, for example, in both Protestant Christianity and in Western secularism, women's bodies have been labelled as too sinful, too unclean, emotional, and sexual for public ministry and public life. In their recent book, Religion and Sexualities, Sarah Jane Page and Heather Shipley suggest that historically, menstruation was utilised as a mechanism for this exclusion, having repercussions to this day. Yet, potentially, standing in a pulpit and acknowledging their bodies that menstruate is exactly what allows women to preach in a way that might counter exclusionary and harmful practices. For instance, in February of this year, Erica Hermentz, the Associate Minister at Barney's Broadway, which is a large inner city church, opened her sermon on the gospel text of Luke 8:40-56 by sharing a story that draws on embodied experience. She reflects on the time that she was in the ocean caught in a rip, and she speaks of her pounding heart and of anxiety shooting through her body. She does this to create a sense of what it is to feel desperate, before introducing the congregation to 2 desperate characters in the text: Jairus, a leader of the synagogue whose daughter lies dying, and an unnamed woman who's been hemorrhaging for 12 years. To align us with this desperate, isolated woman and help the congregation hear what her story can teach them about power and about the God that they believe in, Hermentz does something that surprises me. She speaks about what it is to move through the world in a body that can betray you by bleeding at inconvenient moments. She speaks about periods. When women preach, congregations might just have an opportunity to hear and value the messy, the murky, and the menstruating. Something I'm concerned about here is how to think through an idea of women's preaching as a genre or mode of preaching different to men's without relying on an essentialized understanding of gender or depictions of all women as inherently more skilled at emotion work and body work. But that being said, time and again, people I spoke with suggested that women should preach because they did in fact bring something different to men. They often had trouble pinning down what that difference was. Sometimes it was tied to emotion, sometimes it was tied to bodies, and often it was tied to embodied experience. People told me that because women see and experience the world differently to men, they also read and apply the Bible differently to men. So if having women preach helps congregations listen to, learn from, and value those who bleed, those who are exploited, assaulted, unheard, unnamed, or excluded, it is possible that when the pulpit is open to the voices of women, that churches might become safer, more welcoming, more inclusive spaces where all who want to believe and belong are encouraged to do so. The idea that the Bible has one plain teaching is a discursive trick. It's at the center of complementarian discourse, and it silences diversity and creates uniform and exclusionary cultures within the church. Foucault teaches us that discourse transmits and produces power. It reinforces it, but it also undermines it and exposes it, renders it fragile, and makes it possible to thwart it. Plain teaching is powerful and exclusionary, but in the hands of women, of queer Christians, of any Christian at the margins of church life, it might just be rendered fragile. And I'd like to close today with a story that a woman shared with me, which I think demonstrates this. So Emma is an Anglican woman in her 20s, and she reflects that before coming to her current church, she didn't hear the Bible from a woman's perspective, and sometimes felt that this meant that God and Christianity wasn't for her. She reflects that as a teenager, the harm that I felt then is just that I felt like my whole role and place in the world was really small. I didn't feel like I could be capable of doing anything. This is my life. I'm dependent on the goodwill of others to either marry me or have like a little job and little children, and I cook and clean for them until I die, and then that's the end. I didn't feel that God would use me in a particularly significant way. However, coming to a church where women preached renewed Emma's experience of church. It provided a sense of belonging and safety. She says that women preaching showed her that this truth is for me as well. Tiny references that you probably can't read. Joel, can you stop the screen share? So thank you. And to finish us off today will be Joel, who is here next to me. Joel is a PhD candidate at the University of Sydney, and Joel is interested in how practices of pastoral care have an impact on LGBTIQ plus Christians. And we're just going to do a little bit of technology management here, and then Joel will share his paper.
Thanks, Rosie. I am going to share a screen as well. So much of what has been said already is just resonating so strongly. This has been really powerful. Oops, not that one. That one. Thank you, Rosie and co. For sharing. At war with myself, wrestling, chewing me up on the inside, trapped. These are some of the metaphors that my 24 participants reached for as they sought to describe their experiences of navigating the realms of religious and queer identities. As these individuals sought to grapple with who they are and what they believe, they invariably undertook substantial journeys characterized by deep internal conflict, existential searching, faith deconstruction, and reformation. For all of my participants, this entailed a period of deep shame, silence, and secrecy as they forged their own faith in the confines of the closet. I want to suggest that this process naturally developed a form of lay-led queering of theology, whereby queering, following Lisa Isherwood, I mean a willingness to deliberately and intentionally transgress established boundaries. But in this instance, participants did not necessarily set out to transgress those boundaries. Rather, they were dragged, usually kicking and screaming, out the back door and flung over the parish fence. There in the wilderness, they discovered that they could ask questions. And three key learnings emerged from these questions. For almost all participants, it entailed a joyful reimagining of faith. These three learnings are not unique to queer Christians, but there does seem to be something about the catalytic chaos of the closet that captured their consciences and thereby emboldened them. So I want to explore these three themes before asking how the broader church might benefit from listening to these people's experiences. First, these individuals found an ability to take God out of boxes. Second, they found a willingness to approach heresy or perhaps confidently question orthodoxy. And finally, they found beauty in seeking a deeper spirituality. For 22 of my 24 participants, these realities were directly linked to their time of creating theology from the margins. And it's my contention that if the broader church would take note, they would be enriched by listening to these voices. So firstly, taking God out of boxes. To hear Arden speak about her God is to sit under waves of awe and wonder. In coming to terms with her identity as a trans woman, Arden discovered realities of God she had never thought possible. I feel like my eyes have been opened, she said. Opened to this extra layer of God's incredible creativity that others are not willing to see or haven't listened to or ignored or rejected. So I feel like I've been let into the secret world where God is so much more incredible. Or consider Bethany's words, a young lesbian woman who recounted how her faith shifted while she was in the closet. God is not who we think God is. He's not in a box. He's bigger than we think. And he thinks differently to how we think. I think I've been having God in a box a lot, but now I've been looking at the Bible differently. There are depths to the Bible that we don't even know are there. That's what I think about God. This is a profoundly different approach to the Bible than the literist inerrant approach of Bethany's upbringing. Bethany had previously felt that she had to throw the whole Bible out, but landed instead at this. In a similar transition, Stephen, having unpacked much of his Pentecostal and Catholic background, found overarching themes within the Bible of grace and love were the catalyst for removing the clearly defined boundaries of his evangelicalism. I don't think God is black and white. That's probably the whole result that I've had over the years, said Stephen. I have just witnessed endlessly God's grace, love. And I honestly do believe that God is sitting in heaven going, you dickheads, do you really think that I am that bad? Even in this quote, we see some of the spirit of determination of my participants, a determination which led to our second learning, a willingness to approach heresy or to question the received orthodoxy of their communities. Venturing into the realm of LGBTQIA+ affirmation necessitates a straying from received orthodoxy in almost every denomination in Australia. But those who reconciled and those who were journeying toward identity integration demonstrated a willingness to question, then to critique, and to take on beliefs and practices at odds with their congregations, their communities, and often their families. A fact that in itself is significant. Chris, a gay man, recounted his journey into heresy as a matter of intellectual integrity. I said to myself, if I am going to do any intellectual justice, I would be an idiot if I didn't consider alternative views on sexuality to what I had been taught. There could be nothing more damaging to your faith than only having faith because you have ignored an alternative viewpoint. For Lisa, however, the quote that we see on the screen, the questioning has taken on a more fundamental form. In wrestling with her lesbian identity, Lisa found her understanding of the Bible itself undergoing a significant shift. Lisa described previous understandings of scripture as literal, God-inspired and inerrant. For the majority of her life, Lisa taught from such a framework, both in churches and parachurch ministries. However, in recent years, she has come to terms with her queer identity, and in doing so, this has shifted. She shared that her time in the closet radically shaped her theology, saying, I've come to see the doctrine of inerrancy as an incredibly abusive doctrine, which for me damages the word of God. It damages the people enforcing a literalistic, naive understanding of scripture. I find that abusive and short-sighted, And honestly, that's a journey I'm still on, figuring out where that leaves me. I still love God's people. I still love the church. I still love preaching and teaching, but it's a different experience for me now. It's an awesome journey, but it's way more challenging than it's right there in the Bible. Sounds like what we just heard. Lisa's story is perhaps paradigmatic of many within the Christian community who have come to affirm queer individuals. The shift from a rigid, dogmatic, and literal reading of the Bible to a more complex, nuanced, culturally informed reading is a common occurrence. Far from a simple walking away from orthodoxy, it's consistently spoken of by my participants as a matter of utmost care, of intellectual rigor, and most importantly, a desire to know God. As is demonstrated with Lisa, this goes beyond just issues to do with gender and sexuality and has repercussions in many areas of theology. Jack, who is non-binary, having gone through a period of wrestling with gender, is still finding it hard to comprehend new understandings of God that have emerged. Jack shared, I guess recently I've been thinking a lot about the way we talk about God being a male figure. It feels somewhat blasphemous to describe God as anything other than he. So me exploring my gender identity in the last 2 years made me start to re-examine who I think God is. I'm starting to think about God in a more androgynous or non-gendered way. Jack goes on to say, it still really goes against everything. It gives me an uncomfortable gut feeling. And yet, Jack pursues it because they are willing to approach what is deemed heresy. They're willing to question orthodoxy if that means they are working toward a deeper understanding of what it means for them to have faith. And in this, we see within many of my participants a resilience, courage, dedication, integrity. And that leads us into our third realm of insight from the closet, discovering a deeper spirituality. The trend of queer individuals leaving institutionalized religion to pursue a personally authentic Christian spirituality has been observed for some time. Often in the literature, it takes the form of making a divide between their experience of church as an institution and an understanding of internal spirituality. That separation contributes to one's ability to continue seeing God as fundamentally good, despite negative experiences in church. However, it's often not captured in the research just how complex a nature this process is. James, a trans man, articulated the separation most strongly, stating, the way in which church people can manage to be so much more harmful than many heathens, and so much more othering, and so much more judgmental, really makes you focus on whether you believe in God or whether you believe in church. I think there are lots of times when you can look at people who are speaking on behalf of the Christian church, and it's very hard to see any God. Likewise, Katie, a young queer woman, found a divide between church and God vital for her mental and spiritual journey, sharing. I got to the point of self-inflicted conversion therapy and suicide attempts, praying to God, either make me straight or make me die. Neither happened, which I'm quite glad about now. I don't think I ever stopped believing in God. It was just my attitude toward that belief changed. God was someone I was angry at, or someone I wanted to stay as far away from as possible because of what the church was doing. But now I've got a separation between God and the church. However, it's important to grasp that for the majority of participants who pursued a sharp separation between their understanding of God and their behaviors of the church, found it difficult to consistently maintain that divide. Jack, again, non-binary, shared, trying to remember that God is a safe place and the church is not God is a really hard thing to do. I think it's an easy thing to do intellectually, but for me, being quite an emotional person, even if I know that's the case, If I don't feel welcome at church, it's really hard to spend time in prayer because I think probably I am sinful. Maybe my gender identity is wrong. Do I really think that me in a minority has a monopoly on the truth? Separating God from institutionalized religion appears beneficial to pursue in theory. However, in practice, for many participants in my research at least, the reality was really complex. Even in cases where a separation was desirable, it was not necessarily achieved in a manner that they found consistent or satisfying. And yet, despite this difficulty, participants frequently spoke of a depth of spirituality, of understanding God, of pursuing an integrated faith, which had not been afforded through their time in evangelical churches. So where does all this leave us? When one of my participants, Anna, declared she can't unmeet Jesus, she captured much of the spirit of determination that participants in this study showed. Determination to remain Christian, determination to understand their faith in new light, alongside determination to not allow their churches to drive their spirituality away. In the course of such action, participants often found the God they followed took on a more enigmatic form, larger than the boundaries that traditional orthodoxy had placed on the nature of the divine. And remarkably, for many of them, they did this in silos, cut off from discussing their journeys openly because of the shroud of secrecy that they existed in. Perhaps this is somewhat counterintuitive, or maybe even paradoxical, to what one may have expected from those who have been told that their God does not accept them. Rather than dismissing God as arbitrary or fickle, participants sought to engage God, to meet God in grander terms. And herein lies the rub. Surely it can be argued the Church of the West today would benefit from insights that expand our understanding of God, that show us that God is far larger than we could understand, and that sometimes approaching heresy is the only path to truth, and that maybe, just maybe, the boxes we have placed God in need to be reformed. These are the gifts that our queer siblings give us. These are the diamonds that have been forged in the closet. For ages, these have been the voices on the margins, but as we've heard over and over today, as the 21st century rolls on, we contend that those on the margins have voices that need to be heard. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel. Okay, we've got about 45 minutes to do questions, which are obviously open to everyone, but I feel like it's been a long time since I heard Brooke and Erin, and I wanted to throw a question back to Brooke as we start, because obviously we've all talked about listening to other voices, and Brooke, as you were speaking, one of the things that struck me, probably because I've been looking at reading practices, was your inclusion of William Cooper's reading of the Bible, and how he was not able to align what he saw in the Bible with what he was seeing in the church. And I guess my question to you is, how important do you think encouraging multiple ways of reading like the Bible is, and of having renewed reading practices is?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that Aboriginal Christian leaders have been calling for through the decades as well. So, in my lifetime, one of my great mentors is Uncle Reverend Graham Paulson. And in his paper with Mark Brett, 5 Smooth Stones, talks about the need to read the Bible with Aboriginal eyes. And, as the world's oldest living continuing cultures, and as I said, we are part of God's story and always have been, there's particular insight that we can give to that. Hence why we often say Genesis 1 is the greatest Aboriginal dreaming story ever told. And the likes of Dr. Terry LeBlanc, who an Indigenous theologian who says, you know, Western theologians often start at Genesis 3, Indigenous theologians always start at Genesis 1. And, you know, as you listen to all of your papers, that impact of Western theologians starting at Genesis 3 is absolutely right there through all of our readings. And so we can't discount Indigenous voices. It's not just including our voices, but really sitting with us. We carry a thousands of year old story of the Creator that we can see through the Bible. And so when Aboriginal peoples converted to Christianity, there's a number of reasons that happened through the colonization process. One is it was merely for survival, that on the missions, you wouldn't be killed. So that's the reality. That's part of the truth telling we need to see. That doesn't mean the mission experience was that great either, and many people starved to death. The missions in the centre of Australia, Aboriginal peoples developed scurvy, the horrendous violence that took place in the Christian missions. And yes, there are good missionaries, and that's always the comment I get back, but there are a lot that weren't, and we just have to tell that truth. We hold both sides of that truth, but often it's only the good side that's ever wanted to be told. But the other reality is that our Aboriginal peoples in the past and still today see our dreaming in the Bible, but we don't see it through Christian practice necessarily. And the exclusion we experience in the Australian church, the exclusion we've experienced in Australian theological colleges, you know, it took us 15 years as Indigenous theologians for any theological college in these lands now called Australia to agree to partner with us. And we now have our partnership of NAITS, a global Indigenous learning community that's focused at the master's and PhD level. But it took 15 years for that to happen. And that was only, I was part of the first student cohort back in 2017, sorry. And so it's important. We can't, and it's not just about inclusion, it's actually being led by Aboriginal peoples. And when we get it right with Aboriginal peoples, then all the other cultural, class, privilege, gender, LGBTIQA plus community, all those are different cultures can flourish. And that's why we have to focus on the foundational injustices in these lands now called Australia. And before that, the foundation of the Creator who created these lands and placed us here as the traditional custodians as the world's oldest living continuing cultures.
Thank you. I'm happy. So if people have questions for you, we're a small group. I feel like it's okay just to turn your microphone on and ask a question. But if you are more comfortable typing, please feel free to type. And if we have an awkward silence, I'll ask a question. So does anyone in the Zoom room have a question for any or all of us?
Oh, I have a question for Joel, if I may. Oh, thank you all. Thank you all for that. But a question particularly for John. I was struck by two particular terms in your presentation. One is heresy, the other one is marginality. And I'm thinking, you know, what struck me in regards to those particular terms. When I heard the word heresy, I was immediately thinking of debates some years back on the idea of blasphemy and whether the idea of specifically a blasphemy law makes sense. And the general argument is no, it doesn't make sense in the absence of a state church. So I wonder whether this idea of heresy actually makes sense in a society as diverse, as liberal, as multicultural as Australia. And connected to that, the idea of voices at the margins. I understand very much that these are voices at the margins within certain churches, but if we sort of reorientate the perspective, the spiritual practices, the spiritual journeys, the forms of spirituality, the forms of spiritual authority embedded in the self that your research participants are articulating, they're almost sort of completely hegemonic within a society like Australia. So I wonder whether the marginality, the voices on the margins are not in fact your research participants. The marginality is in fact conservative religious orthodoxy. That is what is completely, largely inexplicable. And I mean that almost literally, inexplicable to a large number of particularly young Australians. Because terms like orthodoxy and heresy simply don't make sense for the vast majority of particularly young Australians.
Oh, that's such a brilliant observation of the, I guess what we see for my participants is there's wheels within wheels that are at play. And so when I look at the way that the church is interacting with particularly queer matters at the moment, you kind of look at it and you think you're shooting yourself in the foot, because not only are you making these decisions around what is in, what is out, what is pure, what is impure, what is true, what is false, you're also failing to explain that in a way that is coherent, that is accessible, that has integrity. And so not only are the decisions being made about what defines heresy and orthodoxy totally perplexing to most people in our society, we've got to the point where Christians, and I speak from kind of my conservative sphere that I've grown up in and that I research in, Christians are now seen as not just the kind of awkward do-gooders, they're seen as actually the ones who are perpetuating evil. Like, and that's a huge paradigm shift that's happened quite rapidly within society. And yet, for many of my participants, they still exist within this sphere, and their parents are in that sphere, their best friends are in that sphere, they've grown up in that sphere, their school is that sphere, or their church. And so their whole community is embedded. And so for them, they're not even thinking about what the broader Australian perspective is on this church. It's the water that they swim in. And so I think when it comes to that, I want to be really specific about the way that I talk about orthodoxy as received orthodoxy or as communally generated orthodoxy, because that's the realm that they're in at that point. And so I want to use their language to describe how they're seeing the definition of heresy and orthodoxy. But you're right, at this point, those who hold that received orthodoxy that we see in a lot of evangelical churches, particularly in Sydney, in this part of the world, they are increasingly on the margins. And I want to say that they still hold power for a lot of people. And they still define orthodoxy for a lot of people who are in their midst and in their communities. And so we have to make a distinction between what the broader society says and what people are actually experiencing from within the pews, perhaps. Does that make sense?
I mean, not that this question was directed to me, but I'm just going to say something.
It's a panel.
Yeah. I think what's interesting about that is that, obviously Joel and I are both in Sydney and have grown up in Sydney churches. And I think that the Sydney Anglican diocese particularly, and, has this history of almost being like a quasi-state church, and, we know that through both histories of the diocese, through like Meredith Lake's history of the Bible in Australia, that, we see that the Sydney Anglican diocese and evangelicalism has been historically so entwined with British imperialism that there's a culture in there of like, we expect to be able, like, the people who run that church almost expect to be able to define society. I'm sure Brooke has 1,000,001 things to say about the Anglican Church and imperialism. But I think that's definitely part of that heritage and why, as Joel was saying, that if you have grown up in that space and you still want to be in that space, your perception of yourself as hovering at the edges is probably very strong and probably very accurate. You know, if you're wanting to study theology, if you're wanting to be a pastor, if you're wanting to contribute in those spaces. And I think that was what I was trying to get at too, that in those spaces, there is a real directionality to, like, we will employ the people who have been to this college, who read in the way that we want them to read, who preach in the way that we want them to preach. And that is what sustains, I guess, that kind of power relation and between a kind of a center and a margin. But yes, of course, in the wider society, you know, all those sorts of definitions of centers and margins are in flux. Did either Erin or Brooke want to comment on those ideas?
I have a.
I was going to say, Brooke, do you want to go first?
You go. Because mine was a question for you.
Sure, I can go first. I think whilst there's definitely direct links between Sydney Anglicans and especially original stolen land, and you think of the words of Marsden that I shared and the interrelationship of all of those things, it's not just a Sydney Anglican problem or issue. And even some of the churches who we probably think as more progressive have still excluded Aboriginal peoples. It is non-discriminatory. The exclusion of Aboriginal Christian leaders from the Australian Church it's across all churches and denominations, and goes back to the very centre of these foundations. I think, as I heard Joel speaking, and this is why I love interacting in panels such as this. I'm so grateful for my fellow panel members for including an Aboriginal Christian leader as a voice in this discussion. This is a rare opportunity. These things don't happen for me each and every day. And through coming together, we hear our different experiences and can help to, because we get to listen to each other. We know how to listen to each other because of being on the margin. But as I was listening to Joel, I was thinking, the margin for us as Aboriginal peoples usually means powerlessness. When some of the denominations and Christians think they are being marginalized, they still hold great power. And that power is even represented in our parliament. And for the everyday Christian who thinks religion and politics are separate things, they're so wrong. There is great power and influence from the Australian churches in our parliament, and that is why we have the injustices that we have today, the lack of political action, the lack of the church leading in societal action for Aboriginal peoples, for women, for against domestic and family violence, for the LGBTIQA+ community. So I guess my final comment is just, it's great to be part of the conversation because these are important conversations to have.
Erin or Tracy?
I just wanted to quickly add that I was having a thought about, I think those margins shift not only intersectionally, which is, I think, something that our panel kind of demonstrates, but I'd say geographically as well. I just wanted to point out the unique, I think, bleeding effect that Sydney Anglicanism has on other denominations in Sydney. And so I think when you get out of Sydney, those margins look different. So I did want to say that, yes, Brooke is absolutely correct that these problems persist across denominations, across these lands now called Australia. But I did just want to highlight that Sydney's this strange beast. Yeah.
Tracy, did you have a question?
Yeah, I wanted to thank Brooke. I just wanted to share a little story. It's short, but my family came here 6 generations ago, and my grandmother, who arrived in Australia against her will, wrote in her diary that the only way she coped was by the comfort she took of the fires of the Aboriginal women who she shared the land with. And so thank you for bringing us that light today. So thanks. And the other, I've got a question for Erin. As you guys know, I'm in the Catholic space. And in preparation for my paper today, I came across these quite horrific prayer resources that were being shared out of the Sydney Archdiocese, Catholic Archdiocese. Do you know of any research that's been like specifically addressing like resources that are coming out of the different, like obviously I'm looking at a Catholic context, but you know, I'm sure there must be similarly horrific stuff coming out of Protestant church communities as well? Or has there been a shift in what's being taught from above, I guess?
Yeah, so I can't think of a study that directly addresses resources, and not one that directly addresses resources denominationally. So, you know, there's another great research area. I think the closest would probably be ANU's ongoing research. So their Centre for Social Research and Methods, they're continuing to do research projects in different faith communities. So I think that includes Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, and then various Christian denominations. So some of their research might look at resources, and so looking at kind of closing that feedback loop, but theirs is probably the closest. And then I'd be interested to see what NCLS's Anglican research project does, but the questions I've seen so far aren't aimed at resources. And then, yeah, I have seen a shift. So I'm Baptist, and though leadership is decentralized, the kind of National Association of Baptist Churches were actually pretty good on getting resources together to the churches on domestic and family violence, and they're not bad. And then, of course, I've got to point to Common Grace's Safer resource. So I am seeing a shift in resources that aren't full of interesting, shall we say, exegesis or poor theology, or a justification for headship and submission. What I'm seeing is a shift to apologies, a shift to, okay, let's build resources, or let's develop resources that are based on the research. But yeah, it's slow and there's a lot of work to do. But as you know, yeah. Thanks. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, Michelle.
So this is my OT question, Erin.
Yay!
So Brooke talked about readings of Genesis, and we know that the LGBT or the queer stuff often references well, Genesis, but Leviticus as well, plus New Testament ones. Are there OT passages that are used to argue for headship and that in sort of endorse domestic violence? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So the first place I often go to is what Tribble called the texts of terror, which I'm sure you're familiar with. There's plenty of violence in the Old Testament, and has been interpreted largely by white men for centuries in certain ways. And so that's often that it was the woman's fault and the woman deserved it. That is shifting also, as you know. But so where my work is in Song of Songs. And so there's a whole history, just a volume of really rich feminist scholarship on Song of Songs that says, actually, there's no violence, there's no headship, there's no submission, there's no stereotypical gender roles between the man and the woman in Song of Songs at all. And interestingly, there's this growing body of queer readings of Song of Songs as well that I would love to do some work in. So yes, I hope that answers your question, and thank you for asking me an OT question.
Ask a question?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'd like to, this is a bit of a muddly question, but
Okay.
it's coming out of my frustration, I think. I'm part of a church that on a national level does a good attempts at you know, embracing people on the margins and putting that into its policies and statements and all that sort of thing. But my frustration is that down on a grassroots level, that is very fickle. It sort of changes with the wind, changes with the leadership. And for me, I see that as an issue with, you know, the reality of people's faith and how that is so changeable. And I'm finding like I was hearing Joel saying that the people on the margins seem to be the ones who are more steady in their beliefs and where they sit. So I'm not sure what my question is, but about this sort of grassroots level, where how do we get these good ideas, these great intentions, these deep faith statements, and embed them at a grassroots level? So I know that's a huge question, but I'd love to hear any comments that you have on that.
It's the age-old question. It's and it's so hard, and I experience it in my conversations with people so often, where they'll say, you know, they might attend, for example, a uniting church, which one is affirming and then down the road it's not affirming, but they'll rock up at the not affirming one and they'll exist there for a couple of years and then discover it. And it's this fear constantly, if at least I know for queer Christians, of committing to a place that you don't know is safe, only to have the wind change and then discover that there's areas that you're not allowed into. And the door is suddenly shut in your face, and it's really painful, because what you're describing, it's not anymore an exercise in academia. Like you're describing the lived reality, and as much as we can sit in kind of academic panels like this, at the end of the day, it's tomorrow when we rock up to church, that's what's going to be the on the ground reality. I'd like to you know, do a shout out to organizations like Common Grace, organizations like Equal Voices, that are trying to capture this grassroots momentum, I guess. And I know there's lots of churches that are trying to think, okay, well, who do we partner with that are doing this well? And so off the top of my head, they're kind of two organizations that I'd say, you know, as much as a top-down approach can have its benefits, that really needs the buy-in from congregations, from local parishes, from ministers. Yeah, that's the hard work, I guess.
I'm thinking about the quote that I shared from Alice, who said, you know, there's something really powerful about hearing someone's voice for 20 minutes. So I think when we look at what churches do, most churches will include like a main teaching time, and that time is respected, and the person who delivers that message like has the respect of that congregation. And I think that I mean obviously like this is what I spoke on, but I think that who a church puts behind that lectern or that pulpit does say a lot about the values of the church. I mean, as far as I know, I think that Brooke is the first Aboriginal person I've heard give a sermon, and I know she's not the only Aboriginal Christian, and I've been in churches like since I was 4 years old. You know, I've never seen a sermon have Auslan interpreters. I've never heard like a 12-year-old give a sermon. I think there's lots of people in church communities who would have, you know, interesting like ideas, things to teach us, who would have reflections on these sorts of things, but we don't put their voices in a place where we're going to hear them. And I mean, I would think that for people in a church community, you know, if they value that space, that maybe part of their activism, like their internal activism, might be to kind of regularly push their church to actually be like, you need to invite other speakers. Because as much as people said to me, you know, women preach differently because they experience the world differently, I think, you know, what intersectionality would teach us is that like, well, we all experience the world differently, you know, and we all see different things, and some of us are more able to see things than other people. And I would think that people in a church hopefully would want to see the Bible and see faith, you know, in the most full way, and that part of doing that is to hear it taught and explained from as many different voices as possible.
I wonder if there's a little bit of a complication there, and this is speaking from my experiences of there's a tension between we need more queer voices or more marginalized voices in the church speaking up, but then to speak up as a marginalized person, you end up getting shot down. And so there's kind of this cycle that perhaps is in danger. And I know the point that I've come to is, I don't get invited to churches, so it's not much of a thing. But if I do, then I want to make sure that that church is a safe space for me to actually walk into. And Brooke, I don't know if I don't know what model you use, but I know for us it's, I want to actually make sure that the church is doing the work and is willing to listen. And it's not just a tokenistic thing. You're not just inviting me as someone on the margins or Brooke as an Indigenous voice or anyone, like you're actually wanting to do the pre-work, to do the post-work, to like it's a whole package, I guess. And so, yeah, I don't know how to break that cycle, but that's just an observation of the dynamic that I've experienced in how churches actually do conversations of listening.
Brooke, do you want to go first, and then I'll chime in?
Okay, yeah, that'd be great. So my Aboriginal Christian leadership journey started in 2012. That's when I became an Aboriginal pastor. And it was probably not until 2014 that I started to get invitations to churches. And I'm not inundated with requests. People might think I am, but I'm not really. Not that I necessarily want to be inundated either. So it's a fine balance. But in a 12-month period, I tracked all the churches I had spoken in. And my introductory message is reconciliation as friendship. And so it is that deep longing for deep relationship, not just the one-off transaction of coming in and preaching. Because for us as Indigenous people, it's never a one-off transaction, it's a relationship. And I think there's lots of people that preach, and particularly white men who, it feels like a transaction instead of relationship. And not that I want to generalize either, but one of the things I would always ask for in that first year of preaching was for one person in the congregation to start up a prayer group to pray for Aboriginal peoples and Aboriginal justice. And I went back over a 12-month period at the 8 churches I had spoken in. Not one of them 12 months later had established a prayer group. And so I'm like, well, how do we actually get to the action? And to go back, Kathy, to your original question, Aboriginal peoples, we are grassroots peoples. And so to look for us, how we've taken that action, whilst we might not have seen the outcomes for the alleviating of the injustice and the disadvantage, the faithfulness that after generation that we walk in the footsteps of those elders, like I said in the acknowledgement of country, that might never have seen those outcomes in their lifetime. But still we faithfully follow Jesus to seek these things. And, when I started researching about William Cooper, I've read every single one of his letters, and then Sir Pastor Doug Nichols and Pearl Gibbs and all of these incredible Aboriginal activists. And the history books will tell you they're activists. What they don't often tell you is they're Aboriginal Christian leaders. And to then read like some of the things I'd been saying, they said them in the 1930s and 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s. Looking at Erin's research, the fact the church was talking about domestic and family violence, we've had report after report, Royal Commission after Royal Commission, and nothing has led to action. And what we need is the grassroots. The power is with the peoples, not where we look to the power, but it can't just be me as one Aboriginal person and an Aboriginal Christian leader who fights for justice, who stands up and says, what you've put in that report, you're not living out in your everyday. And expecting my non-Indigenous friends to stand up who believe the same thing, but yet I'm standing there on my own. And so we need more and more people in all of these different marginalized situations to stand up with us, because the cost for us to stand up and speak up is far greater than a non-Indigenous person. You'll feel the cost, and it's probably the first time you'll feel the cost. But for me, yeah, there's further exclusion upon exclusion upon exclusion. And so to come back to grassroots, that we can do this together, using my common grace language, together we feel less tired and less alone. And the Creator draws us into relationship. That's the whole point of humanity, to come together. And so my prayer is that we do act for the common good.
Just amen, basically. But I did want to say, Kathy, it kind of sounds similar to my experience in my denomination. Bye, Tracy. And it kind of sounds like Joel's experience and Brooke's experience, which is we're starting to hear this willingness, and sometimes it's grassroots, sometimes it's leadership, and it's yeah, okay, we need some more diverse voices. Yeah, okay, we need to listen to people. Yeah, okay, we need to do something about this. And then it's, oh, but not you. Oh, not in that way. And it's like we want to control what it is we hear, and we want to control who says it. So there's this, we start the journey and then we balk. And so I just kind of thought, yeah, don't get too angry. And I just kind of wondered if that resonated with where you're at, and that perhaps we'd had some similar experiences.
Yes, thank you for that. That does resonate. Yeah. You have to excuse me. I have to go to, because I'm doing the next panel.
Okay.
So thank you very much, all of you.
Yeah, if anyone needs to run away, just do the running. We won't be offended. We do. It is only 11:15, so if anyone does have anything else they wanted to ask, there is a moment. But yeah, people are heading off to chair other sessions. So of you who are left, did anyone else have anything they wanted to
I want to ask something. It's just back to that like edges, margins, centre thing. So for my research, I'm studying a young Anglican social justice activists for my PhD. But what I found when I went was that none of them cradle Anglicans. They were all ex-Pentecostals from megachurches that had joined the Anglican Church. And so what they felt was that they were marginalised in the evangelical Pentecostal churches because they were interested in LGBTQ rights, they were interested in Indigenous Māori land issues. None of them are Māori, but they were. They were interested in climate change. They wanted to do something about it. Their churches weren't interested. And so they buggered off to the Anglican Church, the Anglican diocese that I'm studying. So, and I was kind of like, why? Because this is an old institutional church. Like, I come from an evangelical background, so I know kind of what the thinking goes around there. And they're like, oh, this is marginal. So for them, the Anglicans were marginal because they're all dying off, and they kind of need us and our enthusiasm and our whatever. And they've got this. The bishop of the diocese is an ex-Baptist, and he worked with people on the margins for a long time. So he's made all these spaces in the diocese for them to do all this incredible stuff, which is what I studied. But I found it so funny that they thought that they'd gone from being in the centre of Christianity because they were megachurches to being at the margins, and the Anglicans were the margins. Whereas about the Anglicans in the church still think that they are the centre of society. So it was just this kind of interesting margin centre thing, just what you guys are talking about. It's not a question, it's just more a...
Well, I think that goes back to Ibrahim's point about, like, you know, what really is a margin. I mean, I often find this when I'm talking about women's, like, place in society. I'm like, women are not marginal, like, numerically. You know, it's not like, you know, they're going, oh, I've never met a woman before. Which, why, you know, I think for me, I think of it more in terms of access to influence or access to resources or access to opportunities to speak. Is more about how, or, you know, even at a societal level, I think, you know, is it access to lobbying a politician or even becoming a politician, and that those sorts of things are where I would be thinking about in terms of margins and centres. Like, and, you know, are you in a space where you like, do you expect to shape society? Do you expect to be listened to? Is society made to reflect the shape of your body and these sorts of things? Which, so obviously, for me, I think margins and centres or peripheries, these things are very, in some ways, very flexible. I mean, I don't know.
The other funny thing is, they're all like white, middle class, highly educated, mostly female. But they keep talking about being on the margins, and they're trying to work with marginal people, but they're not marginal. So it was just this kind of thing between what we want and what we see ourselves as, where the reality is that you're not. So I'm trying to write about it. It's so hard, but
it's kind of like white feminism, but white marginalism.
Yeah.
Okay, this is an interesting phenomenon. Like,
yeah. But I've got to write these big sections on margins and edges and centres.
Yeah.
And so listening to you guys, it's like, oh yeah.
I mean, of course, there's also the reality that, like, even, when we look at Western secularism or like humanist discourses, that as much as women were excluded from public roles, both in church and in government or in like secular institutions, at the same time, religion was kind of gendered as feminine. So, things that are to do with like the spiritual, like, because it's kind of spiritual, emotional, like, religious practice, as opposed to like the writing of religious theology, which is, intellectual and masculine, right? Because women don't do that. But like religious practice in terms of service or serving a community, I think, this is not quite my research area, but I think that, we would see that is typically a feminine gendered activity. As Enchi knows, I've been reading and reviewing a book called Queer Nuns, where Wilcox, who's writing that book, is looking at this a group of gay male nuns and who do a lot of service work in various queer communities. It's around a lot of sex ed and provision of resources in the States where there is social safety nets are not great, but they talk about how like being in the uniform of a nun's habit, of this thing that is and they're not a Christian group, they just wear nuns' habits because that's part of what they do, and that by embodying this kind of recognized feminine religious persona, communities accept them as community workers. There's this quote in it where one of the guys is like, if I just went into a bar as like, a 50-year-old gay guy and was like, hey, make sure you wear condoms when you have sex, he's like, that'd be weird and creepy. But like when I go in as like a sister and I'm in habit and like we've got our little safety packs, people respond to me as a nun. I am a nun. I am there as a figure of safety, a figure of education, a figure of support. And people read that even if they're not religious, even if I'm not religious. And I mean, I think that idea of like, women as support workers, as emotional laborers, like, sure, there are problems with that, but then, maybe some people are able to use that to advantage. Random thought.
One that I had never heard and now I want to read about.
Yeah.
Do it. It is good.
I'll read your review.
Yeah, excellent. And she will like that. I think we're nearly at time. I was trying to think of what my question around this was, because I know that both Erin and actually I think everyone, Erin, Brooke and Joel, all kind of talked about like trauma work. So Brooke obviously talked about intergenerational trauma and memory of that, and we see that around violence and the harm for queer people. I'm not sure. My question is, I've just been starting to read like feminist trauma theology, and I suppose it's just a generic question, like in terms of your own research practice or pastoring, like how important like a trauma-informed approach might be. That's something you've ever thought about.
Yeah, I mean, I dedicated a whole chapter in my PhD to spiritual and religious trauma because, and I hadn't intended to, it wasn't part of the the original plan. But as I was listening to participants' stories, it just became apparent over and over again that every single one of my participants ticked the boxes, and they ticked the boxes not just from an experiential standpoint. Like, not only had they experienced adverse experiences, but also they were showing symptoms of complex trauma responses. And every single one of my participants spoke about physiological responses to certain circumstances. Only 2 or 3 spoke about the word trauma. And so I came at it with my mental health social workers lens, and I was like, yeah, this is entirely prevalent across this community. It's totally unspoken within pastoral realms that I've been in. No one speaks about spiritual trauma for LGBTQIA plus people amongst clergy. Like, it's not even a realm, because it's done in love, and that's the great barrier that you can't cross. And that's where theology is the causal mechanism of all of this. We don't want to hurt you, but you're hurting yourself. Therefore, the only thing we can do is speak truth. And that is what is seen as love. So, gosh, it gets complicated really quickly. But yeah, there is so much research that needs to be done for queer Christians in this space.
Good job. I think we're basically at time. Did anyone have any final comments they wanted to throw in?
Thank you.
Yeah.
I definitely want to say thank you.
Yeah, I want to say thank you, Rosie, as our chair and organizer, and thanks to everyone who came along to listen.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And thank you to those of you who have stayed till the bitter end. I hope it has been a somewhat enjoyable or informative time. And as Ibrahim is here, and Anchi, thanks to the AASR for having us. We're grateful for that. So maybe it's time for us all to head out into either the next session or the rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thanks.